Welcome, everyone, and welcome for today's presentation, Migrant Field and Messaging webinar. Thank you for joining us today, where we will be engaging in a timely and important conversation that we hope will leave you with new tools, insights, and a sense of empowerment to continue to be a welcomer. I am Basma Alawi, the National Campaign Director for We Are All America, a refugee organizing campaign housed at the National Partnership for New Americans, MPNA, a coalition of 61 immigrants and refugee organizations across 40 states. MPNA works with our members of MPNA together with its member to advance immigrants' equity and inclusion policies, build and expand capacity around immigration, legal services, and immigrants' inclusion programming, and drive campaigns that strengthen our democracy through increased civic participation. MPNA We Are All America campaign has led the emergence of an effective national organizing infrastructure that has mobilized public support for people fleeing violence and persecution, counter nativist forests, developed more welcoming policies and practices in this area at the federal and state levels. With the help and support of our partners, the We Are All America campaign has significantly increased the number of state-based organizers from 5 states in 2017 to more than 20 states today. I want to thank our partners Welcoming with Dignity for co-convening today's webinar that will look into the work that many of you are doing or preparing to do to receive and welcome migrants like us. Over the past several months, we have seen that the political action of governors from Texas and Florida, sadly where I am now, and Arizona, of transporting migrants have backfired as cities, counties, and organizations and community members continue to welcoming newcomers with dignity and care. We know our communities are ready to welcome, and that with the political will and effective coordination, we have the capacity to provide welcome and support to all people seeking safety here. But we also know that instead, the Biden administration expanding Title 42 for Venezuelan seeking asylum. We must work to defend the right to seek asylum and to build system of welcome to support people when they arrive. MPNA, our members and localities, and the We Are All America networks have spent years helping to advocate for and build and strengthen welcoming structure, such as the offices of New Americans, building legal service capacity, and forging communities partnership that are on the front line of receiving and welcoming newcomers. Together, we have demonstrated how quick response structures that have been stood up over the years can quickly be activated so that our cities, counties, and organizations will continue to create solution framework as we call on the federal government to provide greater support to our local and state efforts to meet newcomers with basic needs and on ramps to opportunities to build their lives in cities across the country. Today's conversation will examine the power of narrative, specifically how we can challenge the narrative of scarcity that are eroding support for asylum and other systems of protection and interest policies like Title 42. It's my pleasure to now introduce Bilal with Welcoming Dignity, who will moderate our next section and introduce today's speakers. Bilal is a senior communication coordinator for Welcoming with Dignity campaign, a national campaign for asylum rights in the United States. The campaign is held at the Women's Refugee Commission. While pursuing his master's degree in international development and a School of International Service at American University, Bilal was the communication liaison at the Embassy of Afghanistan in Washington, D.C., where he led the embassy's media relationship. And he does so more than that. He's a friend of mine, a great advocate, and I will give the mic to you now, Bilal.
Thank you, Basma. It is an honor to be introduced by you and to work with We Are All America and the National Partnership for New Americans, cities and counties for citizenship to bring today's webinar that we really hope will be very useful to all of you. Let's start with what we've been seeing, because we've got a packed schedule, and we're really lucky to be joined by some stellar welcomers. We have, I'm really excited to welcome State Representative Dylan Fernandez, who represents Barnstable, Dukes, and Nantucket counties in Massachusetts. He was one of the leaders who welcomed the plane of Venezuelans that Governor DeSantis sent to Martha's Vineyard without any notice. We're also very lucky to be joined by Claudia Tristan of Moms Rising, the immigration project director there, who has been welcoming buses in DC since they first started arriving, and Greer Millard, the communications manager at the Florence Project in Arizona, where they provide social and legal services to immigrants and people seeking asylum in the state there. And then we'll get a little messaging and field training from our partners at NPNA and Welcome with Dignity. Nancy and Stephanie will give us some takeaways, and then we'll hear from Paula, our fabulous Welcome with Dignity campaign videographer, on some tips and tricks to help when we're trying to change the narrative to how people are welcoming, how best to do that. So let me just start by giving a little bit of background. I believe it was early April when Governor Abbott of Texas said that he was going to take the border to Biden. And he announced his intention to start shipping people, using people as political props to cities in the North, particularly DC, New York, Chicago, and then, as we saw, also Martha's Vineyard, because he thought that it would cause havoc and cause chaos and brew up feelings of ill will towards the newcomers. But as we've seen, every single bus, every single plane, every single group of people that has been that has been a part of this stunt unknowingly have been welcomed. And that's why we're here today, to say that the true story, the true character of our communities is in this welcoming. I also want to say that this isn't the first time that xenophobic governors, racist governors have done this. During the 1960s, segregationist governors in the South misled African Americans and told them to get on buses that they called reverse freedom rides and sent them to some of the same counties and some of the same states that we're talking about today. They sent them to Hyannisport and told them the Kennedys would be waiting for them. They told them that there would be benefits and social services for them. So it's the exact same playbook of taking people that they don't like, people who have often a different skin color than them, and using them as political props. The fact that it's happening again in 2022 says a lot about their politics and their morality. And I think it's important to remember that historical context, because it's not just about immigration, it's about the civil rights and human rights of all people, American or not. So with that, I want to really start with Representative Fernandez. Representative Fernandez, as I mentioned earlier, you are the state representative in Massachusetts for Barnstable, Dukes, and Nantucket, and you were one of the first people on the ground to respond when that plane of Venezuelans landed in Martha's Vineyard. Can you just talk to us? What were you doing that morning? What were you doing that day?
Wow, I don't even remember what I was doing because it's such a whirlwind day. But I do remember I was driving home from a meeting when I got a call that it appeared the governor, or we didn't know where it came from, but a plane full of Venezuelan refugees landed on Martha's Vineyard without any notice to the local community. And of course, we had heard people were on the far right were telegraphing something like this for months. And we never thought it would actually happen because it was just such a profoundly racist and cruel thing to do that in my naive mind, I didn't think anyone was that depraved to be capable of such a thing. So when I did hear that they landed, I immediately hopped on the first ferry over the vineyard and greeted the migrants when they came. And by the time I got there, the community had already rallied around these families, these 49 people, women, children as young as 4, and had already stood up a facility for them where beds were provided, translation services were provided, of course, food, water, anything that they needed. And then over the course of the couple of days they were there, more services were brought in around healthcare, a lot of dental care work. We even had kids, Spanish-speaking kids from the local middle school come over and just hang out and play with the kids, the migrant children that were here, doing really everything we could to make sure that they were comfortable and had the resources that they needed. Ultimately, it was a pretty small facility on the vineyard, so they got moved to a larger facility on Cape Cod, and there were met with even greater services, unfettered access to immigration attorneys, a range of healthcare, including mental health care, which was really important, and other types of caseworker care, so that we could get people into long-term housing solutions as well. And while doing this, we ended up raising over $300,000 for the refugees as well. So ultimately, that came down to $6,000 a person. So that and then we brought in a local bank to set up bank accounts for everyone and get them that money. So and now they've transitioned out of that longer term facility. So there's several families that stayed on Cape Cod, and actually there's still coordination around bringing them together, and also there's broad coordination around English classes. So we're providing services for English classes for them to more quickly learn the language. And then several people are back on Martha's Vineyard and have settled there as well. And then of course other people are all over the country with different family members or other kind of footholds here. So look, I mean, these depraved, racist, governors wanted to create chaos, but we met these people, we met these families, these children with compassion. And that's who we are. That's what we did when they sent us, as you alluded to, those kind of reverse freedom rides, those racist rides from the 60s, that was also sent to my district. And we met those people with dignity and respect too. And look, we've been doing it. I mean, that's the crazy thing about these Republican talking points. My district has had the largest growth since the last census of any communities in the entire state of Massachusetts, overwhelmingly from immigrant populations, to the point that Nantucket is public schools are majority minority, and the Vineyard is about a third, over a third non-white. So look, we're growing. It's because of our immigrant population. We're stronger because of it. We're more vibrant because of it. And we're going to keep embracing people and treating people with human dignity that they deserve.
Thank you so much. So it sounds like Governor DeSantis was surprised by the reception in Martha's Vineyard, but you weren't at all, right? You know the character of your community, and you know that they're real welcomers. You're an elected official. Taking this kind of stance in a polarized time is not necessarily an easy one for all elected officials out there. But you're welcoming, and your storytelling around the welcoming has been really extraordinary. So how do you see, how can other elected officials and other leaders around there help shape the narrative around these efforts and welcoming?
Yeah, well, look, I think it's important that we do, and that we take a stand on these issues. And for me, there was a dual role there. One was, I was pumping up air mattresses the night they arrived to get people beds, but then also was hopping on CNN to talk about this and to talk about the common humanity of people. And that's an important role that needs to be played. And look, this was a manufactured political stunt. So it not only deserved a human response, but it also deserved, I think, a bit of a political response back to push back on this. And that's what I think people should be doing. There, it's crazy to me how controversial it was to have a message of treating people like people. That's what I've been grounded in. That's why I ran for office. That's always what I've been grounded in. Treating vulnerable people with humanity, dignity, and respect. That should never be a controversial issue. And if it is, then we need to keep talking about it more and push back on why it might be controversial and really take a stand on it. Because look, this is, dehumanizing people. It's just a common playbook throughout the darkest parts of American history and the darkest parts of world history. And so, a couple of weeks ago, it was Venezuelan refugees shipped on a lie to my district. But who will it be next? What ethnicity is going to be next? What religion is going to be next? And if we don't take a stand on this early, there is a dark, dark spiral where this goes down. And we see it spiraling already in our country. And so it is incumbent upon all political leaders to take a stand against racist, xenophobic actions like this that are also just cruel and depraved and using human beings as political tools. And so I try to be as outspoken as possible on this. And I think we need everyone to take a stand on it.
Well, I think I can speak on behalf of everyone on this call, the panelists and the participants, that I think we admire your clarity on this and hope that more of our elected leaders can learn from you. Thank you so much, Representative Fernandez, for joining us, for your leadership on this. I know that you're busy, so if you have to jump off, please feel free. But I'm gonna now turn to one of the other welcomers that we've been is one of our panelists, Claudia. Claudia Tristan is Immigration Director for Moms Rising. And she has been welcoming the buses in DC since the first one arrived in April. Is that right, Claudia?
I have been helping since spring. I was not there for the first one, unfortunately, but have been there waking up every morning with our volunteers and showing up. And I wish I could say this was the first time I've had to respond to a situation like this. But as you mentioned before, our nation has a history of doing this. And in spring 2019, the previous administration did this in New Mexico, ordering Border Patrol to release processed migrants into small communities across southern New Mexico. And when I say small communities, I mean the most rural small communities that don't even have a bus station in their communities. And again, it is to fuel this hateful rhetoric around people not deserving respect and being treated like humans, unfortunately. So this is the second time I've now had to respond in an emergency capacity to help welcome migrants. And it has been so incredible here in DC. Having done it on the border is one thing because people grew up in those border communities, but here where we're so far away from the border and seeing people show up who have no experience doing this, have never even visited the border, may not even know what's going on in the world of immigration, and they show up day after day to step up, to welcome the buses. And not only that, but to also provide long-term support to migrants who are choosing, thankfully, to make DC their next home, their permanent home from now on, for which we're so thankful to the volunteers who keep stepping up day after day, and to those migrants who chose to make our nation's capital their new home. So it really has been rewarding personally to see volunteers step up day after day, and of course, to obviously help those who need us. It's not easy work. It is time consuming and emotionally and physically exhausting, but it's been incredible to see how the community has come together at this time.
Thank you, Claudia. Can you talk about how has the DC community, like, what are some of the tangible ways that the volunteers have stepped up? And have there been any moments that surprised you, or any moments that really inspired you?
Yeah, I mean, there's different cohorts within the volunteer network. Obviously, if you have additional language skills, we definitely need you to be hands-on and in person, receiving the buses when they arrive in the morning. That's typically what I do. I'm always there at 6 a.m. waiting for the bus to arrive. And then we have other groups of volunteers that show up throughout the day at our respite centers that help serve breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They help making sure migrants have a change of clothes. They also help with an intake process to figure out where migrants are going to, if they have other relatives that they are going to meet with in other cities, and then organizing as well, bus tickets, train tickets to get them to those other cities. And then there's also a whole nother group of our volunteers that receive the clothing donations, and they will go every single day to our storage place and organize all of those donations, whether it's diapers, baby formula, clothes for children, women, men of all ages. And then we also have people who are helping migrants who decide to stay here by teaching them how to use public transportation, or even giving them a tour of the city. Because again, we're in the nation's capital, something they've only seen on TV. And, everyone has this really great interest in wanting to see the White House. Then, well, we're here in DC. So giving them that extended welcome is so, so, so important.
Thank you, Claudia. And I see a question about the recording. Yes, this is being recorded and we'll be able to share with partners. Hopefully we'll be able to share with partners. So one thing that I want to talk to you about, and I have talked to you about, is how, despite the kind of grassroots and overwhelming support from within the DC community, elected leaders don't always toe that same line, right? Like, we know that Mayor Bowser has said some unhelpful things, to be generous, about the buses, and saying that DC needs help from the National Guard, despite DC having one of the biggest budget surpluses that it's had in history, etc. How do you work with your elected leaders when they aren't exactly on message?
I think it's important, once again, to point to the volunteers and the volunteer network. They are the true leaders in all of this. And I think our elected officials, if they're willing to, can learn a lot from the volunteer network and can follow their lead. I also think they've set up an incredible framework for city officials to get involved and to find ways where they can help us and fill in gaps where needed. I would strongly recommend, if any of them are listening, to work closely with us, really ask us what we need day to day, and help us together come up with a long-term plan. Because again, this is history repeating itself. And there is a book now that we can form, a playbook for us that have been doing this since the spring, to better serve all of those who are coming to our nation and coming to DC specifically.
Yeah, so it sounds like just reminding the mayor that you are her constituent and her constituents want to welcome, right? And I think
communities, we want to welcome, and we are showing up every day to do that. So I think this is a great opportunity for her to follow our lead and do the same thing.
Thank you, Claudia. So we've heard from we've heard from Representative Fernandez up north in Massachusetts. We just heard from Claudia in DC. Now I want to hear from someone on the border in Arizona, who obviously is doing this work every single day, not because people are being bused there by bad actors, but because you're on the border. And so let's talk to Greer Millard, the communications manager at the Florence Project in Arizona, which is a legal and social service provider for people in the state. Hi, Greer. So what has it been like in Arizona these past couple of years?
Hi, Bilal, and thanks everyone for having me. So like Bilal said, we provide free legal and social services to immigrants here in Arizona. And so what we've been seeing here in Arizona for the past 2+ years and really longer, but especially for the past couple of years, is border policies that really sow confusion and chaos for arriving asylum seekers. The lack of clear information from these policies, the constantly changing policies, lawsuits, et cetera, really breed an environment in which people often are having trouble understanding sort of what's going on, what options are available to them. And so what's happening in Arizona right now on the border is really two different things. One, in Yuma, we have large numbers of people who are arriving and entering without inspection, which means, entering between ports of entry, et cetera. And that is overwhelming small border towns, sort of what Claudia was talking about earlier, that really don't have a lot of resources or services. And yet local humanitarian organizations here in Arizona have really stepped up to respond and welcome those folks and make sure that they are able to move on to their intended destinations here in the US. And then second, in Nogales, which is where the Florence Project works in partnership with a bunch of other NGOs, including the Keno Border Initiative, we work on both sides of the border to ensure that asylum seekers know their rights, are accompanied while displaced at the border, that once they're in Arizona, they're accompanied every step of the way until they reach their final destination. And then we ensure, they have things like medical access to medical attention, plans with sponsors, food, clothing, other necessities. And we also have many local governments that work alongside NGOs here in Arizona to uphold a welcome system that is more navigable and holistic for asylum seekers. And that's really our goal here in Arizona through these collaborative partnerships to create a better model of asylum processing on the ground that accompanies people so folks are prepared when they move on to other communities in the United States.
Thank you, Greer. As always, inspired by your work and the other organizations on the ground, like Keno. I had the privilege of visiting Keno a few years ago and seeing just like in DC, volunteers showing up and sorting clothes and all the other ways, making sandwiches. It was inspiring. But let's talk about one thing, an important nuance, right? Is like you said that these small towns are overwhelmed and not everyone who seeks asylum in Arizona wants to stay in Arizona. And so in some ways, these buses are helpful, right? Like if they want to go to New York and there's a free bus for them to DC, it's kind of helpful, right? So how do you deal with that? How do you deal with that nuance?
Yeah, so for some folks that may be true, but what I will say is, some of these buses are helpful in getting folks closer to where they want to be, and some folks are ending up further from where they want to be or not where they want to be at all. And I think the folks that are on the receiving end of the buses, I'm sure have seen that as well. But what I would really say is it's hard to say exactly what people want or what is helpful for people when they're getting so little information about their options when they're being when these buses are leaving and they aren't given a lot of options or don't have a lot of information. And I think what the bigger thing here is kind of what everyone has alluded to, which is this is a political stunt that's been using people as political pawns and is trying to cause chaos. But the communities on the receiving end have have not allowed that to happen. They have, through their actions, they've rejected the core premise of the stunt, which is that Americans, the premise was that Americans don't want to welcome refugees and asylum seekers into their communities. But, all of these welcome communities have really called that bluff and said,
Thank you, Greer. Thank you, Greer. Very quickly, just like 1 minute, how can people, groups not at the border help the Florence Project?
Absolutely. There's so many ways. I think you can spread the word, uplift what we're sharing on social media, uplift our statements, counter these racist and xenophobic anti-immigrant narratives. You can support border organizations, not just the Florence Project, but other organizations like the Kino Border Initiative, Casa Alitas, IRC Phoenix, In Project, etc. We have so many people on staff, almost 200 at the Florence Project, yet we're not able to help nearly as many people as we would like. And then, you can organize a local response if you're seeing buses in your communities, or if that does happen in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Greer. And so talking about organizing that local response and helping, shift the narrative, I want to turn to Stephanie Teatro and Nancy Flores, who are with National Partnership for New Americans, who have some takeaways for us that they want to share.
Thank you, Bilal. And hello, everyone. I'm Stephanie, and I'm with the Climate Justice Collaborative at the National Partnership for New Americans. And thank you, especially to all of our speakers, for the really inspiring work that you're doing across the country. So Nancy and I wanted to zoom out a little bit to talk about narrative, which, when you're in the middle of this rapid response, can feel like a little abstract or disconnected from some of the really life-saving work and direct service work that's happening to welcome and support people. But we think it is critically important for what comes next for us to think in that big picture as well. And when we talk about narrative response, we mean like the biggest picture, the totality of all of our external work, our public messaging, and really the public conversation about what's happening. It's not just, specific talking points we should use, or not specific headlines, but really the context and framework and worldview that Americans have when they're reading those headlines. And again, not just in the cities where buses are arriving, not just on the border where people first arrive, but in communities like here in Tennessee, where I am, communities across the country who are hearing about this situation and forming their sort of opinions based on them. So next slide, Andres. So for us, the bigger narrative shift, right? Culture change. This is really what Governors Abbott and DeSantis have been working on. They are trying to change the way that Americans see our immigration system. As many speakers have said, they are trying to create a sense of chaos and evoke feelings of scarcity. And really what they want is for the American public to believe that our immigration system is out of control, that it's overwhelmed, and that it is straining the capacity of our cities. Because if you believe that our immigration system is out of control and it's more than we can handle, then really extreme and draconian policies like Title 42 and shutting down our borders, that can seem more reasonable to you, right? So what happened a few months after this stunt began, right? President Biden's extended Title 42 to block Venezuelans from being able to enter the country and seek asylum. So to the governors who are doing this, this isn't just about buses, right? It's not just about this particular political moment. It's about a bigger contest for narrative, culture change, worldviews. And so we really believe that our local and collective responses needs to not just be about meeting this particular moment, but also working to shift the landscape. So I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Nancy, NPNA's Deputy Director, to talk a little bit about the narrative that we can advance.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. And we'll move it over here to the next slide, please. All right, so Stephanie touched a little bit on the narrative that we see the other side moving and that this is really part of a larger strategy. So I want to move us now into how those of us that are on the ground or that have been doing this work for many years, how we can use this moment to instead drive a positive narrative, a pro-immigrant, pro-refugee, pro-migrant, pro-asylum narrative. We can tell a different story about our community's readiness, willingness, and capacity to welcome. This is where we really want to focus. We can really use this moment to build the case for more generous pathways for people seeking safety here in this country, and stronger, more robust systems of welcome and support for people who arrive in our communities. This is an opportunity that we can use, and narrative can be a vehicle through which we move some of this. So really want to focus here on three core recommendations, if you will, of ways that we can do this. First of all, the point around avoiding crisis messaging is really important. We know that the media coverage that we've seen and will continue to see tends to center on conflict, especially in an election year. There's kind of this pivoting this against that. And we really want to move away from that in the way we're responding. We know that oftentimes really well-intentioned advocates may try to highlight the cruelty of these governors and focus on all of the chaos that they've then had to endure to kind of rush and prepare to welcome people. And I want to emphasize something that Stephanie mentioned here. We know that stories that center on strain of resources, or that immigrants or migrants are overwhelming our systems, really play perfectly into anti-immigrant narratives. Think about what we've heard before. Immigrants are taking our jobs. Immigrants are taking, welfare. All of these horrible, incorrect, and baseless claims that we know are wrong, but they definitely support anti-immigrant narratives. So instead, want to focus on how communities are stepping up to welcome and the infrastructure that exists or is being built, and really avoiding the crisis messaging. Next, we want to make sure that we're leading with values. If we want to shift public opinion on these really cruel stunts on people seeking asylum and the kind of immigration system that our country needs, we really need to ground our messages in shared values. So think to de-emphasize the problems, policies, facts, and figures, which is really oftentimes very easy to do, because that's what we see on Twitter, that's what we see in so many places, but instead focus on shared values. So if the other side is over here and we are over here, how do we get to a point where we're talking about shared values like care, compassion, family, safety, dignity, which is something I've heard a lot on this call and is really spot on and really encouraging. And lastly, for this section, we want to make sure that we're talking about people first. These political stunts we know are dehumanizing, and the subsequent coverage that we will continue to see talks about people seeking asylum as victim or political pawns. So how do we take back the narrative here? In your messages, we encourage that you try to use language and messaging that refers to people first. So instead of saying something like, maybe try instead talking about folks in the context of people seeking asylum, instead of just the blanket term migrants. Similarly, there's a lot of power in telling stories of the people who are welcoming and supporting people that are arriving in their communities. This isn't about red states versus blue states, sanctuary cities versus border states. Instead, this is about families, communities, and neighbors. So that's really where we want to make the shift here. And then we'll go to the next slide. Really want to go into talking about casting a vision of the world we want and how narrative can support us there. So for that, I'll turn it back to Stephanie.
Yeah, so just two last points. So the first is that we can cast a positive and proactive vision as we're responding to these stunts, both in terms of the kinds of local and federal policies and infrastructure we should have in place to welcome people in our communities, as well as really that robust right to seek asylum, both safely and with dignity. And so in contrast to the crisis and chaos messaging, we want to offer a vision of how the state and local governments can work with the federal government. And rather than just focusing on fixing a broken system. We want to be specific and assert better alternatives and solutions. And so some of those have come up. So that might be like resourcing transportation to help people get where they're going or reunite with their families, more legal support and representation in asylum proceedings, funding for housing navigators, etc. So we encourage folks to include messages that provide a vision for how things could be when people are welcomed and supported. And that things can be different, both in the short term with these bus arrivals and in the long term with lasting policy changes. So really try to think about how we're painting a picture of the world that we want, where people can find safety and have the resources and support needed to rebuild their lives here. And then we can also build support for the right to seek asylum itself in our response, right? We know that these political stunts are putting the asylum system and the treatment of people seeking asylum really, really front and center. And so it's an important moment and opportunity to educate the public about the right to seek asylum and to build durable support. But just a note, as we have outlined in our toolkit, which we can drop in the chat, is that as we defend the right to seek asylum, it's important not to undermine support for other immigrants. And so just as we avoid the crisis framework, we can also avoid frameworks that sort of reinforce the idea of good and bad immigrants or the right way and wrong way to migrate, because we know that no matter where someone comes from, how they got here, our local communities work best when people are welcomed and given the resources and support to fully participate in our communities. And the very last point is just that when we're thinking about the story that we're trying to tell across the country or in your community about the capacity and imperative to welcome, really to be intentional about who you can activate to carry that message, right? Of course, elected officials, advocates are essential voices, but so too are the voices of neighbors, volunteers, faith leaders, etc. It's time to really lift up a variety of those voices. And so before I pass it over to Paula, just quickly on the next slide, this is just like a recap of what you can find in our guide with our narrative section in the Always Welcome toolkit. But thank you again for all of your work across the country, and please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Stephanie and Nancy. That was really incredible, robust, and high level all at the same time. And let's take an example of like why those scarcity mindset and viewpoint doesn't actually reflect what's happening in the communities, right? For example, when I was with Claudia documenting two of the buses that arrived from Texas, and Paula was there as well, there was a journalist who was also there tagging along, and she said, I heard that some advocates for the unhoused community are upset because some of these resources are going to help the asylum seekers and not the unhoused people. And we asked the pastor of a church that was welcoming the people seeking asylum, and she said, that's not true. We've been doing both, and we saw it firsthand. We saw the people seeking asylum be given breakfast. And then at 12 p.m., while we were still there and the people seeking asylum were being processed, the church volunteers were handing out bag lunches to the unhoused people in Capitol Hill, right? So that's what it means when we're talking about our communities and how we come together, and there is enough when we share, right? So really, I think a really just kind of a very clear example of why we should avoid the scarcity narrative. And so you talked about who are the messengers, right? We heard from city and state officials like Representative Fernandez. We heard from advocates like Claudia and Greer. And you also mentioned community members, that's you, that's us, right? And to help us figure out how we can step up when something like this happens, we're gonna hear from Paula Ariza from Welcome with Dignity.
That was such a great segue, Bilal. Thank you so much for that. Okay, so I want to speak directly to volunteers and people on the ground that are helping to welcome some of these buses that are coming to the different cities.
We think it's really important for people doing the welcoming work to call other people in. And whether that's, come volunteer with me or, donate some money or, become an ally. But it's through our own small networks, our families and friends, that we can sometimes be more effective, right? Because if we're just like yelling on Twitter to a bunch of strangers, that can sometimes mean nothing. But if I send my mom a video saying, I woke up at 6 a.m. this morning to welcome this bus, look at what my experience was, that can be more impactful. So some narrative tips for volunteers is to share about your experience volunteering, why you're there. What does it mean to you? Why are you waking up at 5:30 a.m. to do this? What is your connection to our asylum or immigration system, right? Have you had any chat with these people seeking asylum? Have they shared stories with you? You can share anecdotes of your time. That can be impactful. I remember Amy Fisher said to me that she gave a Venezuelan mom a ride somewhere, and the mom was telling her, I earned $20 a month, but rice is $3. And so how is my family supposed to survive on that? And so stories like that can be impactful. We want to hear more of that. We want you to share that with your networks. What we really don't want is for volunteers to try to interview these people that are coming off the buses. These people are going through something very traumatic. We want to give them the moment to breathe, to take it all in and to gather themselves for their next steps. So we don't want anyone in their face trying to be like, hey, tell me your story. Tell me what's going on. I'd love to help you. Like that's no. Also, when you're providing aid to someone, that creates a sense of like they feel indebted to you at times. And so they might say, yes, I'll tell you my story. And so no, we don't want to bank on that. We want to respect people's privacy. And we want volunteers to share about their own experience volunteering and not try to tell the story of the people seeking asylum. What else? Oh, and so I'm very sorry. I'm very nervous. I have some like really technical tips. I have a video to share in case people on this call are not familiar with using their camera phone. I know some people aren't, but it's really easy to like in the middle of volunteering, just take, 3-5 minutes to shoot a testimonial. So I want to share some technical tips on how to do that. And if you give me a second, I'm going to share my screen. Okay.
So first of all, if you're shooting yourself, you don't have someone to film you, you want to hold your phone out in front of you as much as your arm will go. And you want to hold your phone at eye level. You don't want to hold it up and you don't want to hold it down. You want to shoot straight at your face. When you hold out your phone in front of you, you want to make sure that you're holding it sideways, landscape. Do not hold it this way. It's going to be better this way for social media. If you have somebody else recording you, you want to make sure that they are close enough that they can pick up your voice, especially if there's like traffic and activity happening behind you. You want to be at like about this kind of a shot at your chest and your head. Mostly you want to be a talking head. And that's usually about 2 arm lengths. It's you and their arm. That's generally a good distance. Try not to shoot against a flat wall like this. Try to find something with more depth. And generally you want to have the action behind you, right? You want to see the intake or, the bus is coming, whatever happening behind you, but you want to be far away enough that you're obscuring people's faces. So that's usually going to be about 20 or so feet. And as you can see, he's pretty far away. You can't make out who that is. But the best thing is always going to be to shoot people from behind. If you shoot the action where they're looking the other way and you're just seeing their backs, that's going to be best for their privacy.
Other things to note, if you want to film what we call B-roll, is that you can film things like the bus arriving, focus on your fellow volunteers and the work that they're doing, whether they're filling out papers, doing intake interviews, it's always good to focus on their faces and get like profile shots of the people they're talking to. You can also get the materials, the donations that you receive, you know, the breakfast that people are getting or the dinner. If you film people getting off a bus at night, that's a great way to obscure their identity. You can also show their feet coming off the buses. Filming large groups from behind is always recommended. Children are very powerful images, but you never want to show their faces. So it's always good to film them from behind, focus on them holding hands with their parents, or just anything really to not show their full face. Two final notes that I want to share with you is just to always remember to include the social media handle, website, or GoFundMe link for the organization that you are volunteering with, because the people watching your video, they may want to help but not have time, but they will have money or clothes or, you know, whatever to donate. So giving them those links is really important. And the other note is just that if you want to participate but aren't that tech savvy, film it and then send it to me. My email address is paola@wrcommission.org. I will edit it and send it back to you in a few days' time so you can post it. Okay, thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Paula. So yeah, if people on this call want to take up your offer, your very generous offer of helping to edit your videos, please do be in touch with Paula and be and anyone else on the chat. 1 second. All right, so thank you. We are going to turn to, in the last 9 minutes of this webinar, we're going to turn to questions and answers, next steps. There's a lot of tools that have been shared already, but let's go ahead and share them again. Welcome with Dignity has a social toolkit and messaging guidance that can help you pivot if you're asked a question that you don't have an answer to, the best way to respond and the best way to present a positive framework. There's also NPNA's Always Welcome toolkit that's in there as well. So for the interest of time, let's just go ahead and put in your questions in the question and answer feature of Zoom. And as those populate, we'll take them. The first question, but yes, I do want to address a question we got from an anonymous attendee. That's kind of the whole point of why we've been having this webinar, which is, how do you reconcile this narrative, meaning the narrative of welcoming, when on the ground organizations say they're overwhelmed and struggling? I think Greer, you spoke to that beautifully, and also Stephanie, I think, why don't we hear from you? And then Greer, if you want to jump in as well.
Yeah, so I think that, what we're talking about is basically like the broader story and what we're emphasizing. And so as folks who are on the ground know that maybe when you're trying to tell this story and lift up all of the amazing work that community members and volunteers are doing, sometimes reporters will still try to sort of chase the conflict and get you talking about the crisis, right? And so what we're being like, well, what do you say if there isn't enough housing, et cetera? It's not a matter of being Pollyanna and talking about, that there is no issue here, there is no problem, everything, that's not what we're saying. It's more about how do you pivot, and again, lead with solutions and talk about the kind of system that we're trying to build. And so in the Welcome with Dignity messaging guide, there are specific examples of how you can sort of pivot the conversation, right? Avoiding the sort of zero-sum game. We can talk about safe and affordable housing for all people, right? Including new arrivals to our community. And so there are some specific recommendations about how you can make the pivot there. But the big message being like our local, state, and federal officials can catch up with the welcoming spirit of our communities, that we are ready to welcome, and we know that we are ready to support people, and with the right policies and systems in place, we can do that. We can do that well.
Thank you, Stephanie. Greer, do you have a take as like a local organization on the border?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And it's something that like we certainly, are always trying to strike a balance with, because there's definitely days, and I don't want to speak for any of our partners, but there's definitely days where we feel, there's so much happening. There's so much news. There's so many people who are seeking protection in the United States who we could help, and we're trying to help. But I think what Stephanie said really resonates. What we're trying to convey here is that as a community and as a country, we can welcome people, and we're trying to counter sort of some of these really harmful messages with a message of welcome, a message of an affirmative vision of our values and what we can do when we all collaborate towards the goal of welcoming people seeking protection with dignity.
Thank you, Greer.
And I'd just like to add, I think that our intention to drive a pro-immigrant, pro-asylee, narrative does not invalidate the fact that this is an overwhelming time for many people doing the work on the ground. I just really want to emphasize that, because both things can be true at the same time, right? And I think we want to think about this longer term. It's not always going to be a midterm 2022 election year. These things will pass, but how are we going to remember this moment in history, right? We want to remember that our communities showed up and that we did the work of welcoming despite all of the odds, right? So I think that they definitely don't want to invalidate, those experiences.
All right, thank you. And we're getting close to the end of time. And before we close, I just want to get to another of the questions really quickly. So from the Interfaith Immigration Coalition, a wonderful partner, given this time leading up to the election and lame duck session, are there particular parts of the country in which we should strive to uplift a voice of welcome? And before I get an answer to that question, I want to remind people that we'll get the recording and the toolkit and toolkits and resources in an email if you've registered. So just a quick reminder. To the question about what parts of the country should we be uplifting most, I want to see, I don't know, Stephanie, do you have an answer for us about that?
I mean, I maybe to answer that, and we are all 501c3 organizations as well. But and somebody else put a question in the chat about sort of how could red states or states like Texas support blue states, and I'm in a red state, right? I am in Tennessee, and so I would just caution. I think we're telling a national story. The point that it's not just these sort of sanctuary cities, it's not just the New Yorks and Chicagos that are welcoming, right? That's also a premise that these governors are making, that there's only some cities or some states in the country that want to, to welcome immigrants. And so I actually think that it is communities all across the country, including those where our political leaders are, starting a lot of these stunts, but for us to show that from border towns to Tennessee to New York City, that we have, the capacity, the readiness, the willingness to welcome, and that we can all work together to do so.
Exactly. Basma is in Florida, Greer is in Arizona. Those are states that we don't always think of as doing this welcoming, but we see that they are. And so speaking of Basma, I'd like to turn to you again. Thank you again for getting this together, getting us all together. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Bilal. That was really amazing conversation. So I want to thank the moderator. I want to thank the speaker and the attendants. And thank you for joining us today. As Bilal mentioned, 12 years ago, I was actually welcomed in Florida and now thriving and giving back to my community, because that is exactly what we really know well how to do. And it's my responsibility now to make sure our communities are welcome. As we have heard from elected officials, organizations, and community members, we are capable and have the capacity to welcome. This is the right things to do. It's what our values ask us to do, and it's what our faith asks us to do. Let's treat people like people and welcome people with dignity. Have a great day, and hopefully you will hear from us about the recording and all of the materials.